everybody, welcome back to the next episode of How to Get Away with Staffing. My name is Colin LeBeau, president here at Foxhire, an employer of record platform based in the United States. And I've got two wonderful people from my team, John Linda Smith and Jamie Henry. And today we're going to talk a little bit about MSPs. Hey guys, how are you?
Doing great, thanks. How are you?
We're on episode 18 already. That's pretty good.
Yep, episode 18. We're solid now.
It's a lot of good information that we've had in these. So
anything over 10 episodes is like better than 99% of people that start a podcast. They don't make it last past 10. So we are here, people. We're here to hang out. So yeah, we're gonna talk about MSPs today. Let's just start with that. There's a lot of acronyms in the staffing contingent workforce world to get used to, especially if you're new. So what is an MSP? Either of you guys, what's an MSP?
Managed service provider.
Yes. Now we all understand. No, I'm just kidding. We don't understand what that means. So what exactly does an MSP do? How are they involved? If I'm brand new to the industry.
Go ahead, Jamie.
Sure. So basically, the managed service provider is a third party who helps to facilitate a client's needs for their contingent workforce. So a lot of times they can't have an active presence on the customer's premises, but a lot of times they don't. So it's a service that's provided either through account managers. A lot of times they'll have a designated point of contact that really understands the client's business and what they're trying to accomplish. And it's a way of kind of consolidating all of those efforts through that one provider. So everything from the needs for placement, any of the onboarding requirements, costs, et cetera, are all managed through that MSP. They do all of the coordination with the various different suppliers and then arrange for those services at the client site. So the client doesn't have to be directly involved with any of the back and forth of the flow of information and the screening, hiring, et cetera, for those candidates.
Yep. Perfect. All right. So what does that feel like if I'm a staffing vendor, right? Like if I am a staffing firm and I'm like, oh, great. Like I would really love to sell to this big hospital or, big company in my area, right? How would I know that they have an MSP? What will happen is you're going to reach out to those clients. You're going to start calling them, emailing them like, hey, can I, we have staffing services, try to talk to people. And what's going to happen is eventually if you get through is they're going to say, well, we don't actually do this ourselves. We use this other company. And then you got to go through whoever those people are, the gatekeepers. The MSP is really, when you're trying to get into a client, is the gatekeeper to that client's spend, right?
I think and that's exactly right. And the way that I think about it now, which for the first 3 years in the staffing industry, I just assumed MSPs and VMSs were the exact same thing. And I didn't really differentiate them, which I think a lot of people might think about. But then I kind of obviously dug into it more, and we've met and talked and worked with a lot more MSPs and VMSs over the last few years. And I kind of think of MSPs as like this way for, if I'm thinking of like a bigger company that you're going into, it's like a staffing provider. You're going to like one hiring manager and like you can talk about the jobs that they're trying to fill, but you also might want to go to another hiring manager in a different department. And the MSP is a way to bring the hiring processes like for all of those different departments that could go like hundreds and hundreds of people for bigger companies and like bring them all together in the same process. So it's like there's not anyone in your department going rogue. Everything is like following the same repeatable process that they can then manage and not have to go between like different things in each department.
Yep, exactly. And they do that through people at the third party entity, the MSP, right? The MSP is really people to help bring it all together. And the VMS could also be involved in a client, is the software they use to do that, right? So you want to think about like MSP, people, process, software is the VMS, and they usually come together and create what everyone calls a program. Okay, so when I first got into the staffing industry, people start using the word program. Like, yeah, how are you guys doing at the program level? I'm like, dude, I don't even know what you're talking about. What's a program? You know, so defining like a program is that process by which they leverage a third party, or however it is they go and organize their purchasing of or procurement of labor, staffing services, contingent workers, however you want to define that. That's what a program is. And yeah, and the MSP comes in as that helper to facilitate that, make it more consolidated, consolidate an invoice into one instead of hundreds of different staffing firms invoicing all their different ways and using all their different softwares and stuff like that. Can be pretty cumbersome to a client. Right.
Dude, like Jamie, actually Jamie and Colin, just for everyone that probably know the most of MSPs and VMSs that I've probably encountered. So like I go to them for everything. But Jamie, does every MSP have a VMS? Or is that I know it's common, Colin, you just mentioned it, but is that like something that's just packaged all the time, or is it sometimes broken out differently depending on the client?
So most commonly, yes, an MSP is going to leverage a VMS. However, not every VMS involves using an MSP. So there are VMS software, like Colin said, the VMS is the software portion, right? So you will see companies leverage a VMS, but not have the MSP involvement.
Yeah. And I think we've said it, but just to be clear, another acronym, VMS is a vendor management system. Just so everyone knows. Yeah. So yeah, not all MSPs use a VMS. I think there are some that you can bring your own VMS, right? And there's others that deliver the VMS for you. But yeah, to Jamie's point, if you are using an MSP, you're probably using a VMS. But you may not use an MSP if you have your own VMS. If you run a self-managed program is what they call that. Self-managed, right? So a lot of times there are benefits and drawbacks to the MSPs in the industry. But let's start with the benefits. And so we'll start with the benefits for clients because that's who typically brings the MSP in. Why are these clients bringing these MSPs in? We've touched on it a little bit, but let's be more specific. Like if I'm a staff member, I'm like, why do you guys have this third party in the middle? What's the point of that? Why do MSPs exist? What's the value they deliver?
I think for a lot of clients, it's really the visibility aspect, right? So it's having everything in one place, being able to see not just the spend for the contingent workforce. I think a lot of times we think about an MSP or a VMS as a way of helping to limit the spend. And in some ways it can be, right? Because they can set capped bill rates. And so it gives them more control. But more so it's a way of centralizing it, having it all in one place and having some uniformity both to the way their contracts work, their invoicing works, their onboarding. It has everything kind of streamlined, which makes it easier to manage and ensures, compliance and that things flow smoothly for the client.
Yep. Yeah, it's just centralization, right? I think that was the main phrase that stuck out to me. Centralizing everything, making it that process uniform, like you talked about, creating competitive pricing across all the different vendors that want to support your company. If you think about it, if you didn't have an MSP managing those conversations, you would have somebody or multiple people managing hundreds of staffing vendors that want to sell to you and making sure they all are pricing you fairly and follow the same process and use the right tools and at X, Y, and Z, they're compliant, right? That's hard to do. If your business is not if your core competency isn't buying services from other companies, then you got to build a function that does that. Or you can say, no, you know what? There's people that are great at that. That's an MSP. Let's work with them. And that's sort of what they're doing.
I think more companies are trying to keep themselves lean too. So like HR was, a huge part of the organization, still is, but like their involvement in so many different aspects of running a business has grown over the last few years. So to keep track of this on top of that, it would be very difficult for them to do and probably require more headcount. So you're kind of outsourcing a lot of the HR tasks so that your team doesn't have to do them. Same thing with procurement. It's, it kind of depends sometimes who's in charge of these relationships. Could be HR, could be procurement in some cases. But again, you don't want to have to like hire a bunch of people to maintain all these relationships. With an MSP, they do all that for you. So all you have to do is pay them.
Right.
That's right. And John, you make a good point about the maintaining the relationships, right? Then they only have to maintain the relationship with the MSP, but that MSP is giving them access to a much larger number of suppliers, and they're suppliers that the MSP is vetting, right? So you have to have meet certain minimum standards to become a supplier for that MSP. So the client no longer has that burden either, and they get a broader reach of talent through those multiple suppliers. And then on top of that, the MSP is scoring and monitoring those suppliers over time to ensure the continued quality of delivery.
Right. Yeah. So there's a lot of value to the client, which is why the clients are bringing them in. What about to the staffing agencies that have to work through these MSPs? Is there any value you can highlight for the staffing agencies?
Yeah, the single point of contact is nice, right? We do hear that from some of our agencies that work with MSPs. They like having a specific account manager, especially if they're new to the client. Where we hear frustration sometimes is when they were established with the client previously, and then the client brings in the MSP, right? And so that's a shift. And then your communication's now funneled through this account manager, typically is the level that you have with the MSP, right? But for those that are new to that client, having that one account manager can really be a way of kind of streamlining communications and helping to have clarity.
Yeah. Yeah, it is tough when you're like, oh, I used to work with Jane at this client and she was great and we liked each other a lot. And then, now you have to work with somebody else and they don't know who you are and they don't remember how much you've worked hard for them, and all those types of problems exist. So that is tough.
Sometimes I know we mentioned this at the VMS, but sometimes if you don't have those relationships with the client and you do have those relationships with the MSP, you're able to get into clients that you might not have gotten into before. And if you can maintain those relationships, score high on those evaluations and scorecards, then you can be getting a pretty good source of job orders to fill for a client that you might not have had access to otherwise. So that's
100%.
Opportunity.
Yeah, so you're getting into an MSP as well as getting into a client. That's something to consider, right? And you're getting into a specific program, right? So when they say, oh, are you doing good at the program level? You might be getting into ABC Hospital's program. And then the people at the MSP might say, hey, you did great on this program. We've got a very similar program over here. Can you come help us over here? Right? And then you get multiple programs. So that is a benefit, right? If you can do well, they can, you can land and expand within the MSP, not necessarily just one client, which is good. But in reverse, we've seen a lot of challenges with firms that are just starting up, wanting to get access to all those job orders and trying to get into every MSP possible, just signing up everywhere. And you see a lot of job orders there, but unfortunately what that usually leads to is success in almost none of those areas because you're spread too thin, you can't follow the processes, you forget you're in these MSPs, and then you sort of get either kicked out or, you spin your wheels, wasting a lot of time.
You get lost in the sauce.
Yeah.
Basically.
You get lost in the sauce and there's too many things to keep track of and you don't perform well and then you get a bad scorecard and get kicked out and it never becomes what you hoped it would. So you definitely want to focus on areas you can perform well, right? If there's a program that focuses in your niche, in the jobs that you specifically know you can fill, at a level you can fill them at, right? Because some of these programs can be very high amounts of headcount. Right. And if you can't keep up and keep people, headed their way, even if you get a couple placements, that might be good for you, but it's not good for them. They want more. So there's also that factor as well, which is interesting. So what about the drawbacks? We're sort of indicating them now, but what are some specific drawbacks if you're considering working the MSP and you're like, I could go direct with these other clients or I could do this MSP? What would maybe hold you back if you're a staffing vendor?
One of the things we commonly hear is just the rigor of the onboarding. And I would say that can be very industry specific, right? So that's not necessarily the case everywhere. However, regardless of the level of rigor, a lot of times there's some ambiguity. So the MSP is not always as clear on some of those onboarding requirements as I think staffing vendors would like, especially if they've been used to that direct access. You have a client point of contact that can give you very specific answers to your questions. Well, when you add that MSP in there is most often language in the contract that states communication has to funnel through the MSP. You can't go directly to the client to get clarification. So the onboarding requirements can be a little challenging to interpret. And we've certainly seen cases where there have been audit findings and things of that nature because onboarding was interpreted differently than by the staffing vendor than what was intended by that MSP. And so that can cause a lot of frustration. It can also drive up the cost and the time to onboard, because oftentimes, in an effort to make sure the client has everything they need or could possibly need, the MSP has a lot of requirements for each individual position that add cost and then, of course, time to that onboarding process.
I think that's a good point, because the onboarding process does lengthen out just because it's more intensive and sometimes confusing. And that's could be also a good thing for some. Like, if someone wasn't onboarding correctly, they bring in the MSP, they can certainly like really nail down the process and make sure they're getting the information they need. But it does hurt, like, ERs like us who can onboard really quickly and do it correctly, that have to then wait on the MSP to get everything figured out on their end. So it's like, it's a good thing for some cases, but then it's also a drawback because it will lengthen it out in some cases as well.
Yeah. And a lot of times the onboarding costs are quite high for the things that need to be done. And those costs are put on the agency. And it's typically over and above what an agency would normally do for onboarding. Like, it's extra cumbersome and costly compared to just a normal placement in that same industry.
Absolutely. And Colin, to your point too, a lot of times you have to do those pieces and submit them to the MSP just to have your candidate reviewed. So the candidate hasn't even been accepted for the position yet, right? Oftentimes there's not exclusivity. So you're competing against multiple suppliers for those opportunities. And just to have your candidate considered, you've already paid for things like background checks, education verification, employment verification, et cetera, competency testing, and you're submitting all of that to have your person reviewed.
Yep. Yeah. And that's a lot of times not necessarily in line with the normal timeline of how you might hire someone either. So the candidate might be like, why do I have to do all this stuff if I haven't even gotten the job yet?
Exactly.
Which is weird. It doesn't really make sense. It's sort of counterintuitive to how you might go about things, but they want that person ready to go as soon as they say yes. And they want you to do all the work to get that done so that when they say yes, if they say yes, that person can show up ASAP.
Correct. Right.
So that's a lot of burden and pressure on you as a staffing agency, especially if you have limited resources to commit to doing all those checks and all those onboarding processes and costs without any guarantee they're going to get hired.
It's also hard to keep your employee or your candidate engaged, right? So in a competitive space where the talent pools are limited, so especially in certain industries where we are seeing, a lot of competing for talent, such as healthcare, it can be very tough to keep those employees engaged in that pipeline while you're waiting for acceptance, right? To even get them to complete all of the onboarding requirements sometimes is challenging. So you'll have that sunk cost when somebody falls off and doesn't make it all the way through the process to even be reviewed for consideration.
Yeah, exactly. And that can put you in a bad place with MSP too, because you committed to having somebody there and then they did not start, right? Which is something they track a lot of times.
And actually, sometimes they apply penalties for those too. So yeah,
that is another drawback. Yes, you have to be aware that if somebody commits to showing up to the job and they don't, or they quit, shortly afterwards, there are penalties that can be very costly as well. And that's where the contract pressure comes in, because the MSP has the keys to the kingdom, i.e. the wallet of the client. They can impose some really tough contract language that puts a lot of risk on the vendors and takes that off of the client, which is the job of the MSP, is to de-risk this type of business.
And drive the cost down.
And drive the cost down.
So, I mean, that's the drawback for a staffing agency. Obviously, there's going to be a lot of pricing pressures applied, especially when they have the MSP with the VMS attached. I mean, that's two different services that they're then adding on top of things. That, including, the good thing, if a client uses them, is if they're driving the price down for the client, then it puts a staffing firm in a tough spot where they're trying to submit candidates for little to no markup. And, it also could drive talent away because the cost of trying to get that talent isn't lining up with what the client or MSP is setting as what they're willing to take. So.
And that's what makes a good program or a bad program. There are good programs and bad programs out there, If clients have unrealistic expectations, then, you know, that'll still flow through the MSP, even if they're in the middle of the relationship. So, and what I've also seen is you get into a program and you're like, awesome, this is great. You support it for a while. And then that client says they don't want to use that MSP anymore. And that program moves to another MSP or doesn't have an MSP anymore. And you don't really have that relationship to go with them again. So unlike in the past where you might have had a direct relationship with the client and, you know, they would say no to you as an individual vendor. Now they're moving the program to another MSP and you don't have any recourse to get connected. You got to go through the process again.
Which is also, it's a good point to stay connected with your contacts at the company, because you never know when they're going to either switch to or from MSP and VMS to something else, or go without it at some point. So if you maintain those relationships, if you can,
yeah, right.
You can take them out to dinner and not, you know, off the record type of stuff if you really want to.
Yeah, especially if you've had that contact prior to the MSP being introduced, right? So we do hear that. And we've also heard that, you know, keeping those contacts can help you to get pulled into new MSPs faster when they do bring one on. So.
Right. Yeah, definitely keep those relationships strong if you can. Sometimes the contracts won't let you, but I don't personally think that MSPs are going anywhere right now. I think there is higher adoption though of technology, so that could change the landscape going forward. But if you're doing any staffing at any type of scale, you're going to run into those MSPs, and it's really just your decision on, do you want to work with MSPs or not? Like, you just got to make that decision up front. There are clients, especially in certain industries, that don't use an MSP or even a VMS, and you can find those clients and support them. But if you're in certain industries, it's gonna be very tough to operate without interacting with MSP as well. So you just got to be prepared for those conversations and understand how to leverage those relationships before you do it. And you can find success if you go through that process, or you can choose not to. It's really up to you. But we hope you found this valuable, and we look forward to episode 19 and beyond. You know, we'll see you next time. Thanks so much.